Hello, everyone. Juxtaposition here. Today I want to talk about Leno LaBianca and Rosemary LaBianca, their murder scene, which was in the mother's home, Corina LaBianca. She owned the 1,655 square foot, one level home at 3301 Waverly Drive, a two-bedroom, two-bathroom home, very modest. Had a nice hillside. There was no swimming pool on the property at that time. It has a swimming pool today. It had a carport in the rear of the property, which was at the top of a very steep cliff that overlooked Imperial Highway, Interstate 5. And the home was constructed in 1922. That's right, I said 1922. This is the neighborhood that Walt Disney came out after his bankruptcy in the cartoon business in New York City, and he came out to join his older brother, Roy, 9 years older, 9 years senior to Walt, and to live in his uncle's home in this neighborhood of the Leno LaBianca crime scene, literally down the hill, within 600 yards was where Robert Disney lived. Robert Disney, who we never talk about. He's the one that housed Roy and Walt. And in 1925, which is 3 years after this property, the murder scene was constructed, Roy Disney and Walt Disney formed Disney Brothers Studios in the garage of Robert Disney's home, less than half a mile away from where Leno LaBianca was bayoneted to death 10 times to his chest. And Rosemary was bayoneted 41 times. So if you add up 41 times to the chest and back and low back for Rosemary to the 10 chest wounds that Leno took, that's 51 bayonet strikes. All right, and Leno had his wrist tied behind his back by a leather ligature, and you should know that the M7 bayonet comes standard with NATO issue holster, and you see the blade goes right on in, so you won't hurt yourself. You attach this to your belt buckle here. This goes onto your belt. And then you tie the leather ligature around your legs so that this won't flop around if you ran or climbed up a hill. And this is 23 inches distance times 2 because it loops. It loops through the tip of where the bayonet business end is right here. And this is the exact leather ligature style that was used to pacify and control Leno LaBianca, who I believe was stun gunned and or chloroformed. This also matches the ligature that was tied to John Kummer, Thomas John Kummer, Tom Kummer. You all know him as J. Sebring. He was age 35, and he was tied with his wrists behind his back and then suspended by a nylon rope, which is about 40-foot long rope, and attached to Sharon Tate's neck. Okay, but J. Sebring, Tom Kummer, had one of these ligatures tying his wrist behind his back, as did Leno, who was 44 years old and a former military policeman for the United States Army. And you should know that there's a number of contradictory police reports that have been typed up and issued and revised and edited, but one report said that Leno had 2 rifles and 5 pistols in his mother's home at the time of his death. Then if you continue reading different reports, you'll hear that there was a dozen loaded weapons in the house. So the gist of it is we don't really know, but we do know that Leno LaBianca stood 6 feet tall, was 235 pounds according to his medical exam report, and 235 pounds, 6 feet tall, and was a professional military policeman in Europe, in Germany, in Switzerland, in London, England, for the United States Army since 1943 through 1946, when he was discharged in March, late March 1946. So he stayed over in Europe 1 year after the World War II in Europe concluded. I believe it concluded around April 1945. And Leno stayed another year before he came home. So you're talking about a person who's very familiar with weapons, and he was pacified. There were no defensive wounds for Leno, so he didn't put up a fight. There were no defensive wounds for Tom Kummer, which means he didn't put up a fight. There were defensive wounds for Abigail Folger. There were defensive wounds on Voytek Frykowski. Now, they were bayoneted 51 times out on the lawn in the case of Voytek Frykowski, who was 32 years old. And Abigail Folger was bayoneted 28 times, which is going to require more than one of these bayonets. It's going to have to be attached to an M-16 rifle, okay? And I'm going to say that we are talking about teams of 3 men, soldiers, trained soldiers, and that would, at Cielo Drive, would require a minimum of 4 teams of 3. That's 12 soldiers. I could be wrong. It's possibly 5 teams of 3, which would be 15 soldiers, armed with the M7 bayonet, and having these attached to their belt buckles so that the leatherettes would be available if needed. I just want you to know that you're not going to hear this from any other site. I'm the only person that is promoting the idea that Charlie Manson and Charlie Watson, who is the person who allegedly did all this bayoneting, right? Age 23 with a bum knee, that he was going to be drafted into the United States Army, but he had an injury to his knee, and so they disqualified him. And that's the only reason that he got framed for this murder, because otherwise he'd have an alibi. He'd be in Vietnam or something like that, right? Or Fort Ord with Clint Eastwood, I don't know, somewhere. So my point is that you've been lied to, and one of the main ways that they lie to you is they conceal lots of facts and details. And as Sharon Tate would tell us if she were alive today, the devil is in the details. And Sharon Tate would certainly know that. She was a John Bonet beauty pageant type from age 6 months. Her mother pimped her out for beauty pageants when she was 6 months old. She won a tiny tot beauty contest in Dallas, Texas in 1943 when she was 6 months old. And there she was, the winner of her first beauty pageant in Dallas, Texas, which was 20 years before John Kennedy had his head blown off, not too far from I. Magnus, but in Dealey Plaza, in a military zone of terrorist amphitheater. That's the theme I want you to pick up on today. None of these murders are random. They're all planned. They're all very well planned. There's no hippies involved in any of these murders. LSD is not a part of the murders. Hallucinogenic drugs are not part of these murders. Amphetamines probably are, and corticosteroid injections possibly are, because anything that gives you game-ready playtime is what you want when you're going to conduct a murder. But the crime scenes at Cielo Drive, which is really Bella Drive, those scenes were constructed by the military. In the case of Leno LaBianca, the home was built in 1922 and adjacent to a Catholic church order of the Immaculate Heart community, has a retreat adjacent to the subject property to the northwest of where Rosemary LaBianca was bayoneted 41 times. Within 100 feet of her bedroom is the Catholic Order of the Immaculate Heart community. They have multiple businesses, buildings on the property next door. And I will give you a link here so you can actually see a photography gallery of the property next door. There's probably a minimum of 5 buildings. And I don't believe the murderers stayed there because they stayed in the barracks on the south side of the property. But the surveillance team, there was a surveillance team, I believe, at 3431 Waverly Drive. That's the Immaculate Heart Retreat. All right, you can Google that. It was also rumored that Katy Perry attempted to buy that property, 15 years ago, and that they couldn't pull it off. But I mean, she's Hollywood controlled, right? She was married to Russell Brand. You know, if you see on YouTube, Russell Brand's got a big podcast series he runs twice a week. He's totally controlled. Don't believe anything he says. He just had Timothy Robbins on his show where Robbins pretended to change his mind about COVID. Nobody's changed their mind on COVID. Either if you followed orders and you believed it, then you've stuck on that. Then if they tell you to change your mind, then you can change your mind. But Timothy Robbins has not changed his mind. He's following orders. We follow orders or people die. Right? It's maritime law. Sometimes when you follow orders, you get killed too, right? Like go storm that hillside. Anyway, the Immaculate Heart Retreat is located at 3431. The murder house is 3301. Now, people, it's been changed since the murders in 1969. It's now 3311. So if you want to compare notes, you're going to have to go 3431, 100 feet away. To the east-south is the murder scene, which hasn't changed too much except that they tore up the front lawn, put in another parking carport. So now there's 2 carports where there used to be 1, and they put a swimming pool in where there was none. And then there was no fence line to the property next door to the southeast, and that address is 3267 Waverly Drive. And there you have 2 houses. You have a 1,500 square foot in-law unit, and then we had a almost 6,000 square foot barracks with 6 bedrooms and 5 bathrooms. I don't know that they're all full baths. I have a feeling maybe 4 were full baths and 1 was a half bath. And there was no fence lines. In other words, you can walk from Leno LaBianca's murder scene property over to where Julia Pacello owned those 2 homes at 3267. There's just 1 mailbox for both houses. You should know that that larger house was used for the Straight Satan's Motorcycle Club, had members who stayed at that home, and they dealt drugs for the clandestine services, and the headquarters for the Straight Satan's Motorcycle Club was in Venice Beach, in the city of Venice, at 1 Clubhouse Avenue, next to Muscle Beach in Venice. That's where Anne Heche was last seen alive, was at the hair salon at Muscle Beach, which is walking distance, a parking lot away from the Straight Satan's clandestine drug distribution headquarters at 1 Clubhouse Avenue. And that's where the knuckleheads worked, and when they weren't doing their drug deliveries and collecting cash. And the cash was turned over eventually to Leno LaBianca, who's the owner of 4 grocery stores and a wholesale grocery produce business. And he can handle the money laundering because he can handle cash deposits. I wonder how the CIA is going to handle drug distribution under centralized digital bank currency, right? Central bank digital currency. It's just so hilarious. So the drug dealers all have to have social security numbers and do what they're told. Anyway, back in that day, in 1969, they used the younger kids and veterans from the United States Air Force and Army and Marines who wanted to be motorcycle riders but sell drugs on the side. And it was very profitable, very lucrative. Anyway, what I'm telling you is that Leno also had 7 apartments in the general area, not on Waverly Drive, but on Glendale Drive and Glendale Avenue and Hesperian and nearby, you know, within a mile to 2 miles, he had 7 other apartments. And I believe that he had drug dealing, clandestine services, people living in them. We know that's a fact. That's true. I'm not just blowing smoke here. Charles Watson was a tenant of Leno LaBianca. He stayed on Glendale Avenue in one of the Leno LaBianca's apartments. Charles Manson, the guy who supposedly murdered him, right? He also lived next door to Rosemary LaBianca's daughter, whose name is Susan LaBarge. See, I don't want to get into this because it's so complicated. I'll lose you. But anyway, Susan was 21 years old when her mother was bayoneted 41 times with the M-7 bayonet. And she lived down the hill, about an eighth of a mile away. And she lived at 4616 Greenwood Place. And she lived with her 25-year-old fiancé, Joe Dorgan. Joe Dorgan was an officer in the Straight Satan's Motorcycle Club, and he didn't get along very well with Rosemary, because Rosemary knew he's a drug dealer, right? But she also knew that her husband was a drug dealer, private banker. So I think it was not that what he did for a living, he was kind of a jerk. Anyway, he's living with Susan LaBarge, who goes by Struthers, which is Rosemary's second husband. Leno LaBianca was her third husband. It's kind of like a Yoko Ono story. Yoko Ono was married 4 times, all right? John Lennon was her 4th marriage. Now, she married 2 men 3 times before John Lennon. See how messed up that story gets? And Yoko Ono was a gajillionaire before she ever met John Lennon. She didn't need his money at all. He's an assignment for her. She comes from nobility class, royalty class in Tokyo. Her father's an elite private banker. Her mother comes from royalty, and she doesn't need any money at all, which might explain why she's been imprisoned in the Dakota for most of my life. Why would you want to live in the place where your husband, your third husband, was killed? Doesn't make sense, right? But then it doesn't make sense that Jeffrey Franklin would be living on the Sharon Tate murder scene in a big 10,000 square foot home. That doesn't make sense either. And it also doesn't make sense that Jose Menendez was murdered in Elton John's house, which was Michael Jackson's house before it was Elton John's house. And then after they cleaned it all up, they installed William Link, the producer for the Columbo detective series. And he lives there. After Jose and Kitty Menendez's blood got cleaned up, then the producer of the most successful Hollywood television detective show, he moves into a murder scene at 722 North Elm Drive, Beverly Hills, 90210. That doesn't make sense. It also doesn't make sense that Timothy Leary lives adjacent to the Sharon Tate murder scene at 10106 Sunbrook Drive. That doesn't make sense unless that's provisional CIA property. It doesn't make sense that Oliver Silverstein Stone would go over there and visit him on St. Patrick's Day, Sunday, March 17th, 1996. That doesn't make sense unless he's fulfilling an obedience oath. It doesn't make sense that when Timothy Leary died, 2 months after Oliver Stone visited him, that the Los Angeles medical examiner on the death certificate typed up the address of the death as 10106 Sunbrook Avenue. That doesn't make sense because there are no avenues in Benedict Canyon. There are only drives. And Sunbrook Drive is a cul-de-sac. That means it's a dead end. No through traffic. Now you can walk along the terrace over to Cielo Drive on the level ground, but you got to go through a couple of provisional housing homes, including the Doppelganger twin home that the military built in 1942, 43, 44. That's when the Sharon Tate murder home was built. It was purchased 10 days before Pearl Harbor in November 1941, and it was two lots were purchased. The one where Sharon Tate was murdered and the lot directly below. Then they were excavated, bulldozed over the next year, and then duplicate houses, which is 4 houses. It's 2 main houses, which are 3,300 square feet, level in, 1-story homes, and 2 swimming pool houses and 2 swimming pools, identical properties, about 300 feet from each other. So you could rehearse the murder at 10048 Cielo Drive, which is on Cielo Drive, but it's also on Sunbrook Drive because you could walk to Sunbrook Drive from 10048 Cielo Drive. You could walk over to Sunbrook. where Timothy Leary lives. So you see, it doesn't make sense until you understand it's a one big CIA military operation. Then it makes complete sense. It makes sense that you'd want to control the 10 homes that surround the murder house. There are 10 homes, minimum. I mean, there could be 13, 14 homes if you count the home above and you count there was one other home on the cul-de-sac, and I'm not counting that. And you can go over to Bella Drive and you can count some of the homes over there. And you can go where the surveillance homes are on Bel Air Road and on Summit Ridge Drive. And you will be up to dozens of homes that could be attributed for surveillance or staging for operations where Sharon Tate was killed. The same can be said for Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. They were surrounded. In other words, once you're in that house, you're dead. If they want to kill you, you can't escape. It's impossible. And that's why you know it's not hippies, because hippies can't get on those properties without being seen. They are military homes. They are 24/7 surveilled. So only authorized personnel can get on and off that property. That's my point today. So all you elite bankers that are listening out there that live in enclaves like in Atherton, or you live in Holmby Hills, or you live in Malibu, and you live in the Malibu gated colony, or you live up on the hill, where they shoot porn. If you live in Hidden Hills, where Lori Loughlin lived, and Rebecca Grossman and Peter Grossman live, and Jose Menendez was planning on moving in. You live in those neighborhoods. You're in a gated community, right? To keep the riffraff away. And you're in a prison. You're incarcerated. Because it works two ways. See, in order to have a fortress and secure your perimeter, you have to lock yourself in shelter in place within your fortress. That makes you like Charlie Manson at Corcoran State Prison. That makes you like Charlie Manson at San Quentin. That makes you like Charlie Manson at Vacaville State Hospital. In other words, who's really the prisoner? Was Charlie Manson the prisoner? Was Charlie Watson the prisoner at Mule Creek? Don't you think it's ironic that Charles Watson was ultimately transferred to Mule Creek State Prison, in Ione, which is outside of Sacramento, the state capital, and who joins him is Lyle Menendez, who I believe is completely innocent of murdering his parents, and he's there. Just like Charles Watson is innocent of murdering Sharon Tate and Leno LaBianca, but he's at Mule Creek. And then John Fraser joins them. He's the one who supposedly killed the entire Victor Ota family and his secretary, Dorothy Caldwater, and typed up a manifesto and drove a red maroon Rolls Royce and parked it down the driveway and structured a arson fire and burned down his Frank Lloyd Wright house all by himself alone and killed their kitty cat. One guy, 24 years old, living in a creek bed, he did it. And all three of those guys end up at Mule Creek. John Lindley Frazier, Charles Watson, who loved women, had sisters and girlfriends, but he wants to go on a rampage with the M-7 bayonet, which was never found. There's no murder weapons. No murder weapons have ever been found in any of the crimes that these people were convicted of. Charles Watson, convicted of 7 murders, no murder weapon. John Lindley Frazier, somebody used a .38 pistol and a .22 to kill 5 human beings and throw them in the swimming pool at 999 North Rodeo Gulch Road in Soquel, Santa Cruz County. They blamed it on John Lindley Frazier, sent him to Mule Creek. And then Lyle Menendez, after 6 months of not suspecting him, gets arrested because of some wackadoodle woman who's having an affair with her psychologist and was living with his wife in their home in Beverly Hills when they unceremoniously threw her out. So in a hissy fit, she goes and makes up a story that Lyle and Eric killed their parents. And that's why Lyle and Eric were arrested. It had nothing to do, there's no murder weapon. So anyway, those 3 people, Lyle Menendez, John Lindley Frazier, Charlie Watson, they all end up at Mule Creek. I think that's where they send the scapegoats so they can control them easier. All right, so I wanted you to really understand. I'm going to post some links below so you can personally look at the proximity to the homes. There are other homes I'm not going to mention on this that could also be CIA controlled houses. But you're going to see that these crime scenes have, in the case of the Victor Ota, they have a St. Francis Order retreat approximately 1.5 miles up North Rodeo Gulch Road. So that also has a Catholic retreat, as does the Leno LaBianca, Carino LaBianca crime scene. What I wanted you also to know was that Leno was a good Italian boy. He was born and named Pasqualino LaBianca, but the kids in school couldn't pronounce the name, so they changed it to Leno, and they spelled it Leno instead of Lino. His father was Pasqualino Antonio LaBianca, and he started into the grocery store business in 1920. He went very quickly into the wholesale business, which meant he had relationships with the farmers, and he ran a wholesale produce business. And then later, after Leno came back from World War II, he wanted to go to USC to get his finance degree, so he did that. But then they bought some grocery stores. They bought 4, and later they bought 7, and then they had 11 during the 1950s. They expanded the retail grocery business to 7 during the 1950s. That coincided with the drug trafficking in Los Angeles County. So it's possible that Leno's father was in the money laundering business, because I'm telling you, he made most of his money with the wholesale business, which isn't as easy to do laundering with. All right, because that's not a cash business. The farmer gives you the produce, you write him a check. You don't deal too much in cash with wholesale. But in the grocery business, it's 99 to 100% cash. You pay your vendors maybe with a check, the farmers that give you the produce. But you see, when you own the wholesale produce broker, you don't have to do it that way. In other words, you can layer it. That's called layering within the money laundering system. So what I'm telling you is that Leno LaBianca's father set up an apparatus that's perfect, ideal for money laundering. In other words, Leno didn't do it. His father set it up. Then when Leno came back from World War II in 1946, he goes to USC, where George Lucas went, who's totally controlled, where Lori Loughlin attempted to get her 2 daughters into USC by paying $500,000 worth of bribes. That USC. Anyway, so Leno graduates with a Bachelor of Arts degree in finance, and he then goes to be the president, CEO of Gateway Markets and State Wholesalers. But I'm telling you right now, without counting the drug business, the profits would emanate from the wholesale brokerage business, where they sell to hundreds of grocery stores. They don't necessarily want to own the grocery stores, but they did own 11. Then, while Leno was the president of Gateway, they unloaded 7 of the grocery stores, probably because they're not that profitable. And you don't need to have 11 grocery stores. You can do money laundering with 1. But they had 4. He had 4 grocery stores, and that's where the money laundering is going to be. And then you can use the wholesale business, known as state wholesalers, to consolidate the money laundering. And they had a controller named Ray Norwood, and he'd worked with Leno's father, right? And he told the Los Angeles police that Leno took $200,000 of cash in the 4 years leading up to his death. Now, I don't believe anything that Ray Norwood says. He's up to his eyeballs in money laundering, either with Leno or with Leno's father before him, or with both of the Leno LaBiancas. So my point is that he's not going to tell the police the truth. Okay? And the police don't have the authority to delve into this, because I'm talking about a clandestine services crime. Like FTX. You haven't heard Doug Leone's name mentioned at all. All you hear about is Caroline Ellison and Sam Bankman-Fried, who's not going to be freed. He's going to be fried once he gets on that Stanford campus. Right? He's going to commit suicide, I think. And he's certainly not going to go to trial. They don't have trials in maritime law. So there's no such thing as a trial. Charlie Manson never got a trial, so why would Sam Bankman-Fried get a trial? All right? So what you should know is that this is a decades-long apparatus. And in June 1969, Leno LaBianca informed his older brother-in-law, Peter DeSantis, spelled exactly the same as that CIA operative in Florida. Ron DeSantis, Navy intelligence, prisoner dilemma game Ron DeSantis, Yale, Harvard, Ron DeSantis. Yeah, there's a Peter DeSantis out in California, and he was the president of the Knights of Columbus, Western region. Sons of Italy. He belonged to all the secret society orders in Los Angeles, and he married Emma LaBianca, who is the older sister to Leno. Leno was the youngest of three. He had Emma and Stella and Leno, okay? And Emma got married first to Peter DeSantis, who also worked with Leno's father in the business before Leno went off to World War II in Germany and continental Europe. And you should know that he's a big shot, and he made most of his money as being an officer of the Knights of Columbus, which was it's not just the local chapter. He's in charge of dozens of chapters all over, from Alaska to Honolulu, Hawaii, to Denver, to Seattle, to Portland, down to San Diego. He's got a big operation. And it's interesting that he would be told by Leno that he's quitting, and then Leno then gets murdered within 45 days of that conversation. Leno is dead. Then there's another Peter Smaldino. Peter Smaldino. He married Stella. See, there's the two Peters. There's Leno, but his sisters are not involved. They're having children and they're stay-at-home mothers, so they're not involved with the gateway markets. They're not involved with the business. So their husbands are. And Peter Smaldino was very involved. He was the most involved. And when Leno sold off 7 of the grocery stores in 1964, and for $400,000, which is like $4 million today. It's more than $4 million today. Anyway, he sold that off, and then Peter Smaldino was not happy being second fiddle to Leno because Leno's younger and less experienced. Peter knew more about the grocery business than Leno did. Leno knows about money laundering, which was his main purpose. And so he was making some family trouble. So Leno paid him $250,000 cash to get rid of him, to buy him out of his interest, his sister's interest, Stella's interest. So that tells you that there's 4 owners of the operations. There's Karina, who is the mother. There's Emma, there's Stella, and there's Leno. And if you paid one $250,000, then that means that the entire business is worth $1 million, which today would be like 10, 15 million. Anyway, we don't really know what the true value of the business is, because a part of the business is the money laundering, which is run through the business but is not part of the business. In other words, you deposit the money and then you withdraw it to change the character of it, and you kick back whatever your split is with the clandestine service private banker. And I don't know what Leno's split was, but according to Ray, he took $200,000 in 4 years, and that sounds like a low number to me. That's $50,000 a year. His split was probably, he got, a third. So maybe there's $100,000 that goes to the clandestine services every year. I think the numbers are probably higher than this, because you certainly don't need to bayonet people 10 times for something that's under, $20 million. But anyway, that's what they did, so I'm expecting that the numbers are larger than advertised. So Peter Smaldino was exited out of the business in 1964, leaving Peter DeSantis. Peter Smaldino was out. Peter DeSantis was in, but he's busy with his Knights of Columbus. And Leno is running the show along with Ray Norwood, the controller. Anyway, what you should know is that the home where Rosemary's daughter lived at 4616 Green Park Place. That's the Melrose Place apartments for the television show Melrose Place. That's the house. She was in apartment number 4, upstairs and in the rear on the south side, southeast corner pocket of 4616. I think there's 8 units in that apartment building. And she was in number 4 with Joe Durgan, who's a officer of the Straight Satans, working with Danny DiCarlo, who's the treasurer. And they're both working with Leno LaBianca, who was living in the Walt Disney home at 4. They're living at the Walt Disney Mansion in Griffith Park on Woking Way, and I just forgot the address. It's here somewhere. "4053 Woking Way." Google it. It was 6,188 square feet. And I told you that Leno was murdered in his mother's house, which is 1,655 square feet. There's no reason for him to move from, a mansion with a tennis court under the Hollywood sign into his mother's home, except that he was quitting and he was moving to San Diego to run and buy a horse farm ranch in Vista, okay, which is very rural and beautiful and set back about 20 miles from the town of Oceanside, which is Camp Pendleton, United States Marine Base. About 20 miles from there. He's going to race horses. He owned 11 racehorses. He sold 2 and had to put one down because it broke its leg. That left 8. So at the time of Leno's bayonet murder, he owned 8 racehorses, and they were stabled at Santa Anita, which is just to the east of Pasadena, out kind of where Peter Smaldino bought a beautiful home in East Pasadena in Arcadia. And Arcadia is very close to the racetrack where Leno had his 8 racehorses. All right, so he's not hurting for money, and he's not embezzling. The word embezzlement is sometimes used at that CieloDrive.com, site for the Charlie Manson murders. I mean, that site's a CIA site, people. It's just poppycock. It is interesting and it is fascinating, but it has nothing to do with the M-7 bayonet or the ligature. And that is why it exists to this day. I mean, who do you think's paying for the website maintenance at CieloDrive.com? I mean, it's the clandestine services website. They have all kinds of mendacities over there, sprinkled with some truths. But anyway, you should know that it's a money laundering hit. And the reason why it was a hit is he's quitting. Which explains, why Abigail Folger was murdered. She's seeing a psychologist 5 days a week, Dr. Melvin Flicker, and she's telling him, all her secrets, and he's recording the conversation and relaying it to the clandestine services. And she's booked in a United Air's plane flight out of Los Angeles at 10 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, August 9th, to go have it out with her mother, who's the #1 private banker, age 62, in San Francisco, who runs the Haight-Ashbury Project and runs the Amphetamines Research Project and is the boss and lords over Timothy Leary, Jim Jones, Paul Tate, Sharon Tate's father, has to report to Abigail Folger's mother, right? And then David Smith, Roger Smith, a federal parole officer of Charlie Manson, if you believe that, which I don't. Anyway, Hunter S. Thompson, Ken Kesey, Dianne Feinstein, Nancy and Paul Pelosi roll into town, 1969. Perfect timing. Perfect timing for the Abigail Folger murder, which is probably going to terminate the relationship with Enos Mahina, don't you think? Right? So someone's got to take over her job. Maybe Paul Pelosi did, right? Anyway, that's my point. My point is that these crimes, where they occurred, 999 North Rodeo Gulch Road, in the case of Victor Ota, which occurred in October 1970, during the Manson murder trials, that occurred when they were hearing testimony from the jailhouse snitches for Susan Atkins, which is complete mendacity. There was no Susan Atkins' confession in the jail. Are you crazy? And they forgot to mention she has a 9-month-old baby boy. So you got to believe a 21-year-old little girl with a 9-month little baby boy who's been doing babysitting for the last year, babysitting, various children, and including Mike Love's children. Mike Love actually, has said that numerous times, that Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel babysat his children. Okay, so come on, she can't go over and get an M7 bayonet and chase people around the property. 102 bayonet strikes? I don't think so. For 4 people? All right. Anyway, think about that. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. We'll talk soon. Hit the like and subscribe. Have a nice day.